It's often said that recruitment is the most important thing in football, but it has also never been so collaborative. Gone are the days where even the biggest clubs would only have 2 or 3 scouts dotted around the world. Managers would sign players based upon a single recommendation, or indeed, managers themselves would be carrying out scouting missions independently and solely deciding who they should sign. Now clubs have vast scouting networks throughout the world, complex data harvesting and analysing software, and head scouts, heads of recruitment, directors of football and chief executives, who may all have to rubber stamp a signing, whatever the manager thinks. As Ruben Amorim put it in his first press conference at Manchester United, quote, "Everybody has to work together," adding, "but the final word should be the manager. Not just because it is your right, but because it is your responsibility." End quote. So managers are maybe less responsible than they used to be for their records in terms of recruitment, but they still bear ultimate responsibility. And in the Premier League, the biggest, richest, and the highest spending league in world football, it is vital that managers get those big decisions right. Brighton and Brentford were League One rivals in the 2010-11 season, down in the third tier of English football, but now they are 5th and 9th in the Premier League table respectively, thanks largely to phenomenal recruitment over the last 10 to 15 years. Manchester United, by contrast, have been the highest spending club on transfers in all of world football since Sir Alex Ferguson retired in the summer of 2013, spending over €2 billion in total and €1.4 billion net, yet they have regressed from being perennial title winners to 6th, 7th, and even 8th place finishes since then as a result of their poor recruitment. Among other things. In today's video then, I thought that it might be interesting to take a look at each of the current 20 Premier League managers' records in terms of recruitment, and, specifically, their biggest howlers or blunders, not just at their current clubs, although it could be, but throughout their entire managerial careers. So without further ado, who is neither a current Premier League manager, nor has he ever been signed by a current Premier League manager, that is exactly what we're going to do. Here is every Premier League manager's worst ever signing. Mikel Arteta, Albert Sambi Lokonga. One of the biggest takeaways from researching this video was just the number of relatively young and inexperienced managers that there are in the Premier League, and Mikel Arteta is one of about 6 or 7 who fall into that bracket. Arsenal is Arteta's first job in senior management, which means that all of his signings, all 34 of them, including loanees, have come at the Emirates since his appointment in December 2019. Arteta has overseen some brilliant business during that time, probably most notably Martin Ødegaard, Gabriel Magalhaes, and David Raya. In terms of the misses, Willian is arguably the worst signing sanctioned by the Spaniard, looking slow, sluggish, and a shadow of the player that we had all seen at Chelsea, following what was admittedly an excellent debut at Arsenal, although he didn't command a transfer fee. Willian, very unusually and, I suppose commendably in modern football, actually walked away from over £20 million at Arsenal by allowing the club to terminate his £220,000 a week contract, which still had 2 years on it left to run, in order to push through a move to Corinthians. If he hadn't have done that, he probably would have featured. Pablo Mari, meanwhile, was another blunder, much less costly in terms of wages, but Arsenal did actually pay a reported €14 million for the Spaniard. When you combine his loan and transfer fee from Flamengo, he made just 22 pretty forgettable appearances for the Gunners, suffered injury problems, went out on loan, got stabbed, and was sold for a reported €6.2 million. Hardly catastrophic, except for the stabbing I suppose, but not ideal. Albert Sambi Lokonga, who is still contracted to Arsenal, takes the crown for now though. It is a crown recognising him as Mikel Arteta's worst ever signing, but it is a crown nonetheless. Hey look, these days, you've just got to take what you can get. Signed for a reported £17.2 million by Arteta in the summer of 2021, having spent the last 2 seasons starring for his boyhood club Anderlecht in Belgium, Arteta described Lokonga as a very intelligent player who has shown great maturity in his performances during his development upon his arrival at the club. As was documented in the All or Nothing Arsenal docuseries though, Lokonga struggled mentally with the adjustment from being a star man to not playing. He clocked up 39 appearances for Arsenal in all competitions over his first 2 seasons, many of them coming off the bench it should be said, but he didn't manage to endear himself to Arsenal supporters or make any kind of substantial impression. Loan moves to Crystal Palace, Luton Town and currently Sevilla followed, the most recent with the option for the Andalusians to sign him on a permanent basis for just £10 million. Unai Emery, Jesé Rodriguez. Mikel Arteta's predecessor at Arsenal, Unai Emery was actually the man in charge of PSG when they more than doubled the world record fee, signing Neymar for an enormous €222 million in 2017. Given the finances, expectations, and failure to lift the Champions League, you could make a case for Neymar's inclusion, but he was often PSG's star man when fit, and they did actually recoup €90 million when they sold him to Al Hilal, for whom he was genuinely a terrible signing. Stronger contenders are Nicolas Pepe, the most expensive African footballer, and Arsenal's signing of all time when he joined the club, albeit Emery didn't really have much to do with that deal, David Luiz, who was less costly but a bit of a car crash, and Ciro Immobile, who set Sevilla back €14 million, never played for them after signing on a permanent basis, and was sold for less than €10 million. Eclipsing all of them, however, is Emery's €25 million signing of Jesé Rodriguez. Brought in from Real Madrid, where he was a rare Los Blancos Academy starlet, to step up to and actually make a real impression in the club's first team, Jesé made over 30 appearances in 2 Champions League winning seasons at the Bernabeu. Things got off to a fairly poor start in Paris though. In September 2016, just a month after his arrival, Jesé told reporters while out of the team, quote, "Cavani is a great player, but I am no substitute." End quote. Emery defended Jesé publicly, for a while, claiming that he needed time and his frustration was normal, but the Spaniard soon illustrated that it wasn't a one-off, his ego really was the size of Mount Vesuvius, meanwhile his performance levels were worse than someone like Mambiram Diouf's. Sent out on loan to Las Palmas, Stoke City, Real Betis and Sporting, all did little to resurrect Jesé's fortunes, reputation, or increase his sell-on value, and in December 2020, following 18 appearances in 4.5 years, only 12 of them in the league, PSG terminated Jesé's contract by mutual agreement. He currently plays for Johor Darul Ta'zim in Malaysia, aged 31. Andoni Iraola, Raul de Tomas. A phenomenal manager who only entered management with AEK Larnaca in 2018, Andoni Iraola hasn't had many clangers yet, but his time will come. There are 1 or 2 concerns at Bournemouth. The Turkish international Enes Ünal might become one of them, signed from Getafe for £13 million last February, and yet to open his account this season for the Cherries, but it is still early days. Raul de Tomas, by contrast, was Iraola's biggest signing at his former club, Rayo Vallecano, brought in for a potential €13 million from Espanyol just 10 months before Iraola departed. €3 million of that was in add-ons, most of which, you'd have to assume, were never activated. Having been the talisman at Espanyol for the preceding 2.5 years, scoring the same number of La Liga goals as Vinicius Jr., and fewer than only Iago Aspas and Karim Benzema during his final season in Catalonia, it would be rather a large understatement to say that De Tomas hasn't replicated that form in Madrid. De Tomas has scored a truly miserable 5 goals in 44 La Liga games since rejoining Rayo, and he hasn't played a single minute of league football this season. The 30-year-old has gone from being touted as potentially being Spain's starting centre-forward at the upcoming World Cup in Qatar when Iraola signed him, to not being able to get a kick for a team that is currently 13th in the La Liga table and only narrowly avoided relegation last season. He has cost Rayo more than €1 million for every goal that he has scored for the club. It is actually a pretty staggering downfall, and with not much competition for Iraola, De Tomas is a very easy inclusion. Thomas Frank, Halil Devizoglu. Thomas Frank has only ever managed 2 clubs, Brøndby for 3 years, where his signings included Teemu Pukki and Christian Norgard, and Brentford for the last 6 years, who have probably had the best and most consistent recruitment in English football, alongside Brighton throughout that time. Frank, or Brentford's greatest hits during that time, include the likes of Ivan Toney, Ethan Pinnock, and Brian Mbeumo, but one of very few players to fall short of expectations was probably Halil Dervisoglu. Signed from Sparta Rotterdam in January 2020 for a reported €3 million while Brentford was still in the Championship, unlike with most Brentford signings of the Benham era, it didn't appear as though the club had a clear idea of where Dervisoglu was going to fit in. The young Turk should probably rephrase that one. The young Turkish international only made 4 appearances for Brentford in the Championship before going out on loan to FC Twente, Galatasaray, twice, and then Burnley. In the summer of 2023, following just 12 appearances for Brentford in all competitions, Dervisoglu joined Galatasaray on a permanent basis for just €500,000. A rare blip in the grand scheme of things, and far from catastrophic, but still Brentford's worst piece of business during Frank's time at the helm. Fabian Hürzeler, Matt Sweefer. 7 years younger than one of his own players at Brighton, Fabian Hürzeler, who has made a flying start to life managing the Seagulls, is just 31 years old, and to be totally honest, he hasn't really overseen any genuinely bad signings. He initially managed semi-pro FC Pippenried in Bavaria's regional leagues, then he enjoyed 2 sensational seasons with St. Pauli, and this is only his first season managing Brighton. In place of an actual bad signing, as a placeholder as Hürzeler's worst at this moment in time, I've had to pick Matt Sweefer. Signed for a reported €30 million from Feyenoord in the summer, Sweefer was renowned for his work rate and intelligence during his time in the Eredivisie. As yet, despite Brighton's excellent start, we are probably yet to see the very best of the 25-year-old in the Premier League. It is, of course, extremely early days, and any one of Brighton's almost £200 million of enormous summer investment could turn out to be Hürzeler's worst signing yet. But for now, Sweefer is probably the most appropriate inclusion. Given Brighton's track record, however, especially with midfielders, he will probably end up joining Chelsea for €200 million in a couple of seasons' time and be nominated for the Ballon d'Or. Enzo Maresca, Kiernan Dewsbury Hall. There were no major blunders on Enzo Maresca's part during his single season at Leicester City, which was a bit like managing an under-21 team in an under-15s competition, with even Tom Cannon capable of retaining his sell-on value with a decent season on loan at Stoke. Meanwhile, he barely stuck around for long enough at Parma to sign anyone. Over the summer, however, Maresca was at the helm while Chelsea signed a further 11 players for a mere €238 million, which is what is otherwise known as a quiet window for Chelsea these days. As with Hürzeler, it is far too early to judge all of them, with even Mark Gay and Caleb Wiley capable of becoming important players one day for Chelsea. Who knows? But if there is one exception, it is probably Kiernan Dewsbury Hall. A spectacularly pointless signing, Dewsbury Hall was Maresca's captain and talisman at Leicester City last season, but in a team that has more midfielders than Greg Wallace has sexual harassment allegations, as good as he is, and don't get things twisted, I do actually rate him as a player, his first team prospects were always going to be limited. The theory goes that Maresca wanted someone in his midfield that he could trust, knowing Dewsbury Hall well. Meanwhile, Leicester needed a big windfall via a player sale due to their ongoing PSR issues. Maresca is currently finding it hard enough to fit Moises Caicedo, Romeo Lavia, and Enzo Fernandez into the same midfield, though. Just the €300 million worth of midfielders there, of course, with Dewsbury Hall not even making the Chelsea bench at times. It's early days, as I say, and Dewsbury Hall should get minutes in the cup competitions, but barring a midfield injury crisis which elevates his status, this reeks of Jack Rodwell to Manchester City or Alex Song to Barcelona. Oliver Glasner, Marin Pongracic. Following an outstanding first 3 months at Crystal Palace last season, Oliver Glasner has found life a little bit more challenging, understandably, without Joachim Andersen and Mikel Elise this season. Glasner's most expensive signing ever, Eddie Nketiah, may be yet to hit the ground running, still without a goal for Crystal Palace at the time of this recording, but there is still plenty of time for him to turn that around. Marin Pongracic, by contrast, was a significant signing for Glasner at Wolfsburg, brought in for €10 million from Red Bull Salzburg, in what was a bit of a disaster class. Pongracic's time in Salzburg had been plagued by injuries, making the fee that Wolfsburg paid for him a big risk, and it was a risk which massively backfired. In only his second appearance, Pongracic was sent off after elbowing Alfredo Morales, meanwhile he missed the start of the following season with glandular fever. In total, Pongracic made just 23 appearances in 2.5 years contracted to Wolfsburg, before being sold to Lecce for €1.6 million. Sean Dyche, Wout Weghorst. Despite being widely perceived, rightly in my view, as having done a very good job with modest resources throughout the course of his managerial career, perhaps solely by virtue of being one of the Premier League's more experienced managers at this stage, Sean Dyche does have a decent array of dodgy signings. Everton paid over £25 million for Beto on his watch, who has since scored 4 goals in 38 Premier League games. Burnley forked out £11 million on Mate Vidra, who scored 8 goals in 82 games before departing for nothing, and the Clarets also paid a club record £13 million for Robbie Brady in January 2017, whose time at the club was blighted by injuries. He made just 81 league appearances in 5 whole years, and also departed for nothing. The worst of the lot, however, surely, has to be Wout Weghorst. A marquee signing for Burnley, Weghorst set the club back £12 million, and having scored 70 goals in 144 games for Wolfsburg, bringing him to Turf Moor seemed like a real coup. Sean Dyche hailed Weghorst time and time again, even after he had been sacked by Burnley and was managing Everton, but there can be no two ways about it, he proved to be an abysmal signing for the Clarets. In return for his £12 million and substantial wages, reported to be £60,000 a week, Weghorst scored just 2 goals in 22 games. He went out on loan to Besiktas, Manchester United and Hoffenheim, and then he was sold to Ajax for less than £2 million. Marco Silva. Jean-Philippe Gbamin. For about 5 or 6 years, Everton made a habit of making terrible signings, and Marco Silva's time at the club was no exception. Moise Kean cost €30 million and only scored 2 goals in 32 games, although the Toffees did at least recoup their money when they sold him. Meanwhile, Yerry Mina also cost an eye-watering €30 million before departing for nothing, but did at least have his moments when fit at Goodison Park. Jean-Philippe Gbamin, by contrast, was a very expensive signing with almost no redeeming qualities whatsoever. Brought in for £25 million from Mainz in the Bundesliga, the Ivorian international was ruled out for injury for virtually the entirety of his first 2 years at the club, registering just 3 appearances during that time. He made another 3 appearances in the 2021-22 season, doubling his tally for the club there, before going on loan to CSKA Moscow and Trabzonspor, and eventually joining Ligue 2 side Dunkirk on a free transfer. In total, Gbamin made 8 appearances in 4 years in an Everton shirt, costing the club a little more than £5 million per appearance, when combining his £25 million transfer fee and reported £75,000 a week wages, or more than £120,000 for every minute that he played for the club. On a per-minute basis then, Gbamin was, quite possibly, the highest earner in world football at Everton, and he is not just Marco Silva's worst ever signing, but among the worst in the history of the sport. Kieran McKenna. Ali Al-Hamadi. Ipswich Town is Kieran McKenna's first job in senior management, and near enough everything that he has touched at the club has turned to gold. The loan signings of Dane Scarlett and Brandon Williams from Tottenham and Manchester United respectively last season, you could argue, were a little underwhelming and a misuse of funds and a loan spot, but it hardly mattered, as Ipswich enjoyed one of the most impressive overachievements that the Championship has seen in recent times. From a tiny pool then, Ali Al-Hamadi, who seemed like a really good bit of business to me at the time, is maybe the most reasonable inclusion. Signed for a little over £1 million last January, having smashed it at AFC Wimbledon in League 2, Al-Hamadi scored 4 goals in 14 games in the Championship, and has, perfectly understandably, having been playing League 2 football less than a year ago, looked a little bit out of his depth when he has been brought on so far this season in the Premier League. Al-Hamadi's exploits in League 2 mean that he probably retains his value. I'd certainly take him at Hull City for £1 million still, but from McKenna's almost faultless recruitment to date, he just about takes it. I also think that there is a chance that Jack Clarke has too many flaws to his game, despite his obvious talents, to succeed in the Premier League right now, but even if Ipswich go down, he will be one of the best players in the Championship. Ruud van Nistelrooy, Anwar El Ghazi. Off to a winning start against West Ham United at Leicester City, having won 3 out of his 4 games in interim charge of Manchester United, Ruud van Nistelrooy did a fine job during his brief stint in charge of PSV. The likes of Luke de Jong, Guus Til and Xavi Simons, all brought to Eindhoven on Van Nistelrooy's watch, proved to be sensational bargains. But Anwar El Ghazi was perhaps a rare misstep. PSV only paid a reported €2.5 million to take El Ghazi off Aston Villa's hands, but following 3 seasons in the Premier League, his wages were substantial. El Ghazi wasn't terrible for PSV, but his debut campaign was a little bit underwhelming, and at the start of his second, his contract was terminated by mutual consent. Not exactly a disaster then, but for a manager who has only ever signed 27 players, including loanees, he is still the worst. Arne Slot. Federico Chiesa. Perhaps this one will come back to bite me, since Federico Chiesa is undoubtedly very talented, and so far at least, it seems as though Arne Slot can do no wrong at Liverpool. However, there is a reason why Juventus were willing to sell Chiesa for less than Chelsea might pay, for a not very good 6th choice goalkeeper. Chiesa has had a horrible time with injury since January 2022, and he is yet to hit double figures in terms of league goals, since doing so for the first and only time in the 2019-20 season at Fiorentina. Just 3 games into his Liverpool career, Chiesa was sidelined with yet another muscle injury, which has ruled him out ever since. Considering his reported £120,000 a week basic salary before bonuses, at a time when Liverpool are desperately trying to find the funds to keep Mohamed Salah, Virgil van Dijk and Trent Alexander-Arnold at the club, while Chiesa is talented enough to make me eat my words, I think that there is a decent chance that he proves to be an unwise piece of business. From Slot's time at Feyenoord, meanwhile, Ayase Ueda and Luka Ivanusic earn honourable, or, I suppose, dishonourable mentions. Pep Guardiola. Kalvin Phillips. Pep Guardiola has rarely been short of resources in management, and the likes of Jack Grealish, Matheus Nunes, Benjamin Mendy, Zlatan Ibrahimovic, and Dmitro Chiginski could all have been reasonable inclusions. Kalvin Phillips, however, surely has to be the worst of the lot. Signed for a hefty £42 million, plus £3 million in future add-ons, Phillips' Man City career has consisted of less than 600 minutes of football across 4 competitions in his debut campaign, barely 300 minutes in his second campaign, Pep Guardiola calling him overweight, and then Pep Guardiola apologising for calling him overweight. It's hardly been a roaring success then. Phillips' half-season loan move to West Ham was also a disaster, decimating his reputation and sell-on value even further still, both of which he is now attempting to revive on loan at Ipswich Town. When you combine his transfer fee and wages, on a 6-year deal, Phillips is likely to set Man City back somewhere in the region of £90 million, so yeah, pretty dreadful. Ruben Amorim. Ruben Vinagre. The only manager in this 7 whose worst signing, in my opinion, shares the same first name as them, Ruben Amorim made some sensational signings at Sporting Club de Portugal, from Manuel Ugarte to Pedro Gonçalves and the unstoppable Victor Gyökeres, but Ruben Vinagre was a rare dud. Signed from Wolves for a reported €10 million, following a loan spell at Sporting and having had 2 stints within the club's youth ranks, during the same month that he signed for them, Vinagre joined Everton on a season-long loan. Ravaged by injuries at Goodison Park, Vinagre subsequently joined Hull City on loan in the Championship, but he was recalled by Sporting in January due to a lack of game time. Having spent the second half of last season on loan at Venezia, Vinagre is now on loan with Legia Warsaw in Poland. In other words then, Sporting paid €10 million for Vinagre, he hasn't played a single game for the club since then, he is on pretty decent wages, and he has eroded practically any sell-on value that he may previously have had. Anyhow, Jordan Ibe. Sorry, I'm not sure why Eddie Howe looks quite so haunted there. You could make a case for Orestes Vlachodimos, the Greco-German goalkeeper that Newcastle signed, for £20 million in the summer. Despite the fact that he is 30 years old, he barely got a kick at Nottingham Forest, who paid about a quarter of that to sign him, and he seemingly has no chance of usurping Nick Pope, being Eddie Howe's worst signing. Vlachodimos is one of a number of suspicious transfers, shall we just say, during the last window, but that is another video for another time. Ultimately, given Bournemouth's more modest resources compared to Newcastle's, the hype, and the fact that there were no possible ulterior motives, Jordan Ibe has to go down as Eddie Howe's worst signing to date. The man who supposedly meant that Liverpool wouldn't miss Raheem Sterling, Bournemouth paid £15 million for Ibe in the summer of 2016. During his debut campaign, Howe described Ibe's form as, and I quote, "disappointment for him and for us." End quote. Never a good start. In 92 appearances for the Cherries, Ibe scored 5 goals and made 9 assists in all competitions, departing for nothing when his contract expired in 2020. Ibe most recently played for Hayes and Yeading United in the 8th tier of English football. Nuno Espirito Santo. Fabio Silva. Nuno Espirito Santo has made a handful of shoddy signings, including the likes of Jota, who was signed for €30 million by Al Ittihad in 2023 and sold for €10 million just 12 months later, and Brian Hill, who is yet to provide much in the way of a return for the more than £20 million plus Eric Lamela that Tottenham paid to sign him, currently on loan at Girona. Both of those may be bad, but they are child's play, quite frankly, compared to the totally unmitigated catastrophe that was the signing of Fabio Silva. Wolves' success following their Chinese takeover was built on the back of talented players brought in from Portugal, and Fabio Silva, given his transfer fee, was supposed to be the most talented of the lot. He set Wolves back an enormous club record £35 million, despite the fact that he had only made 12 league appearances and had scored just 1 goal for Porto up to that point. It was a huge risk, and in truth, Silva's development would have been far better served by spending at least the rest of his teens in Portugal. Thrust into the first team earlier than anticipated due to Raul Jimenez's skull fracture, despite his obvious talent, physically and mentally, Silva wasn't anywhere near ready to be a starting number 9 in the Premier League. In total, in return for their £35 million outlay, Wolves have so far got 5 goals from 73 appearances in all competitions out of Silva over the course of more than 4 years. Currently on loan at Las Palmas, I can see a world where Silva still becomes a success in a Big 5 league, but it is hard to see that being at Wolves, and even harder, possibly even impossible, to see him ever justifying anything like the outrageous fee that they paid to sign him. Russell Martin. Leslie Ugachukwu. All of Russell Martin's most significant signings have come at Southampton, most of them last summer, following promotion to the Premier League. Centre-forward Ross Stewart, as a result of injuries, has made just 9 appearances and scored no goals since Martin signed him for a reported £8 million from Sunderland 15 months ago. Ben Brereton Diaz has also scored no goals in 10 games since arriving for £7 million from Villarreal, and Cameron Archer, who I'm surprised by to be honest because I think, or thought that he was a talent, makes it a trio of struggling strikers with only 2 goals in 13 games since his more than £15 million move. Maybe this is harsh because he is only on loan and has so far only played 6 league games, but Leslie Ugachukwu has looked some way off it up to this point. Signed by Chelsea for over £23 million last summer, Ugachukwu played 15 times for the Blues last season, and on paper, seemed like a shrewd signing by the Saints. In reality, following an impressive EFL Cup debut against Cardiff City, Ugachukwu has struggled, with Russell Martin recently stating that the player, quote, knows the reason why he has been left out of the squad entirely. Premier League clubs only get 2 loan spots, and Southampton, who can't afford to get much wrong this season, are currently using both of theirs, plus a combined £110,000 a week of wages, according to reports, on Leslie Ugachukwu and Maxwell Cornet, both of which may well be cancelled in January. Ange Postecoglou, Lucas Bergvall. The jury is still out on a lot of Tottenham summer signings, who set them back over £120 million, but the cheapest out of them all, Lucas Bergvall, is probably the one currently causing the most concern. Signed from Djurgården in Sweden and aged only 18, it is way too early to write Bergvall off. When a young Freddie Ljungberg joined Tottenham's rivals Arsenal from Sweden, at a similarly young age, it took him a season to settle in before becoming a force of nature. But it still feels, at this moment in time, as though this was a jump which is both too steep and has come too early for Bergvall. I may well be proven wrong, but after finishing 5th last season, while Archie Gray, Wilson Odobert and Lucas Bergvall could well turn out to be great players in the future, there is a sense in which Tottenham could have done with 1 or 2 statement signings for the here and now in order to take them from 5th and up into the Champions League places under Postecoglou. A quick mention for James McCarthy, meanwhile, who Ange handed a hefty 4-year contract to at Celtic, but who only played 27 games for the club and has subsequently had his contract terminated. Julen Lopetegui, Ronnie Lopez. Julen Lopetegui is currently a Premier League manager at the time of this recording, hence he features, though he might not be one by the time that this video comes out. Objectively, the worst signing Julen Lopetegui has ever made is probably Alvaro Odriozola, who Real Madrid signed for a potential €35 million under him in 2018. He made 34 league appearances in 5 years, and then rejoined Real Sociedad for €3 million. The likes of Suso and Mariano Diaz were also pretty shoddy signings, but given Real Madrid's ability to absorb the hit of a bad transfer here and there, when contextualised, I don't think that Julen Lopetegui has sanctioned a worse deal than Ronnie Lopez. Sevilla signed Lopez for a reported €25 million from Monaco in the summer of 2019, meanwhile convicted sex abuser Wissam Ben Yedder headed in the opposite direction. Ben Yedder had scored 70 goals in 138 games for Sevilla, and would go on to score 118 goals in 201 games for Monaco. Meanwhile, Lopez made just 14 appearances for Sevilla, scored 0 goals, and made just 1 assist over the next 4 years contracted to the club, before departing for nothing. It was a transfer which went about as well as Lopetegui's time at West Ham is currently going, if indeed he hasn't been sacked by the time that you watch this. Gary O'Neill. Hamed Traore. Wolves signings Rodrigo Gomez and Jean-Ric Bellegarde, signed for €15 million each in each of the last 2 summer windows, get a look in, but ultimately, Gary O'Neill's worst signing, and therefore our final inclusion, is Ivorian international Hamed Junior Traore. The most expensive signing made by a club managed by O'Neill, Traore set Bournemouth back a reported £22 million, or €30 million according to the Italian press, a huge expenditure for a club with the lowest revenue in the Premier League. Once touted as a wonder kid, and an absolute superstar to be honest with you for me at Hull City on one edition of Football Manager a few years back, I suspect that is of little consolation to Bournemouth fans. Since joining Bournemouth on a permanent basis, Traore has made 3 Premier League appearances, 6 in all competitions, playing a grand total of 44 minutes of Premier League football and 181 minutes in all competitions. He has contracted malaria, and he's gone on loan to Napoli and Auxerre. That is £500,000 a minute in the Premier League, before you even factor in Traore's reported £50,000 a week wages. So, this one feels like a fitting and appropriate place to finish up. That is it for today's video, which took longer than I would have liked as I got quite seriously sick. You know, these things happen. Thank you all, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. I hope that I still sounded okay. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, not just for this channel, but also my second channel, Alfie Potts Armour, both of which should be about to appear imminently on your screens, along with a couple of videos that you might fancy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, Threads, and most recently Blue Sky, should you wish to do so, and all of those links plus a whole lot more good stuff should be down in the video description below. Cheers!